I'm really excited to have Greg Garrett join us today. Greg is an old friend. Probably shouldn't say old friend, a friend of some years, and a former colleague at Baylor, where Greg still teaches online currently. And Greg lives in Austin and is the author of many works of fiction, nonfiction, uh, memoir, theology, just pretty much a little bit of everything, and is a cultural critic who writes a lot about film and music. And I've learned a great deal from Greg's work over the years, um, and I know that's going to be true for all of you here today, and me included. So, Greg, thank you so much for being here.
No, you're so welcome. Thank you so much, Pete. And it's great to see all of you and those of you who are watching later. Thanks for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
I got an email from Greg a little while ago, and this is the kind of one of the beautiful things about the internet is that I had no idea that Greg has been working on this book for Oxford University Press that just came out in June, called A Long, Long Way. It's about race and American film, and two subjects that are very close to my heart. And my only regret is that I didn't have the opportunity in Waco to sit down with Greg more in person and talk about these things. But I'm really glad we have this opportunity now, and it's a very timely book. And it's available through Oxford University Press, Amazon, your local bookseller. I'll put up a link in the chat here so you can go order a copy today. And but in the meantime, we'll get a little preview of what this is all about. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit, Greg, about what was the genesis of this book, and maybe even what were you working on before this, and what was there kind of a transition that led you into writing about this subject?
Yeah, this is a book that is very dear to my heart because there are a lot of personal reasons that I wanted to write it, and a lot of professional reasons that I wanted to write about it. And in my tradition, we talk about vocation, about doing the thing that you're called to do. And there's a saying about vocation that when your deep need and the world's deep need come together, that you have found the place that you're supposed to be, and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And so as we live in an increasingly divided culture, politically, culturally, religiously, racially, one of the things that I've been drawn to, especially in my theological writing over the last 10 years or so, is to talk about how to have conversation with each other and how to bridge the gaps between your gated community and my gated community, because we all live in gated communities. And we tend to surround ourselves with people who look like us and think like us and worship like us and love like us. And that's just human nature. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to continue writing about how to have conversation about one of our most difficult subjects. It's basically, this is a book about all the things that you're not supposed to talk about in polite company. It's about politics, it's about religion, it's about race, it's about sex. And this is the kind of thing that would get you in a lot of trouble at your family's Thanksgiving table. But what I discovered during the course of the 4 years that I was working on it, and we'll talk more about this in just a second, I'm going to park this in just a second, but I discovered that film, just like literature, which I've been teaching at Baylor for 31 years, is an avenue for people to dig deep into really powerful human conversations. And I've known this forever, and if you ever had a great literature or film or humanities class, you know this. If you've ever taught a great class, you know this. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second, but I also want to mention quickly before we move deeper into the book, the sort of personal reasons that I wanted to work on this book, and the personal reasons that I reached out to Pete and John because of this amazing work that they're doing on A Deeper South. I was raised in the Deep South. I began school in Atlanta and Charlotte. I went to schools that had been recently desegregated. And even as a tiny person, I remember noticing how my teachers sometimes treated my Black classmates differently than they treated me. And you know that children have this really powerful sense of justice. They talk about things being fair and unfair. And so one of my earliest formational memories is of racism. And it has been a lifelong, problem that I've wanted to explore and do whatever I could to be on the right side of. And the other sort of really personal thing, I was telling Pete about this earlier, but during the darkest period of my life, I was rescued by a historically African-American church in East Austin. And their history is what allowed them to save me. They had begun in the 60s and 70s to start welcoming white people and Asian people and gay people, even though they had been formed as a church because they were not allowed to join white Episcopal churches in Austin. And there were some people who said, this is going to change who we are if we open our doors to everybody and become this place that is no longer the historical African-American church. And they sat down, all these church founders, you know, the men in their beautiful suits and the women in their beautiful hats. And they had a conversation about it. And the decision that they came to that ultimately saved my life was they said, knowing what it feels like to be rejected, we will never offer anything but a radical welcome to somebody who walks in our doors. And that radical welcome in the face of the history that they'd endured not only saved my life, but it changed my life. It changed the course of my life. They sent me to seminary where I studied theology formally and began bringing that piece into the critical and journalistic work that I was doing. And so this is a book that brings together a lot of personal and professional things for me. I care deeply about race and about trying to have these conversations that will help us in the direction of racial healing. And ultimately, film proved to be an amazing way to do that. And so I said I was going to park this, and let me come back to it quickly, and maybe we'll talk about this some more. But I just want to mention, whenever I talk about this book, and I have talked about it a lot since it came out in June, national media, international media, I've been on Marketplace on NPR. It's just crazy the amount of interest. And I've also talked to a bunch of organizations, to churches, particularly to primarily white organizations and congregations who saw the George Floyd video and cannot unsee it and are trying to figure out what their next steps might be. So I always want to make sure that I give credit where credit is due, because the great idea for this book was not my idea. David Andrews, who is an Episcopal priest in Delaware, invited me to come and do one of the things that I do, which is to come in and lead a retreat. And he said, my church was formed when two congregations, a Black congregation and a white congregation, were put together. And we've worshiped together for 10 years and we've done justice work together, but we've never really had deep conversations about identity. And we've never really talked about the elephant in the room. And he said, I think that if you come and show us some movies about race and lead us in some conversations, we might be able to do that. And he was like absolutely right. So the first night I showed Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which is the 1967 film with Sidney Poitier. I talk about it in a chapter in the book. And before we were done, I was just amazed at how, starting with characters in the story, and I knew this from my time in the classroom, but starting with characters in a story instead of from our own fixed positions allowed us to dive back into our own humanity. And we had these incredibly rich conversations that night and the next day when we watched Do the Right Thing and Crash. And we had this incredible sense of connection that was made possible by the really powerful emotional storytelling that happens in a movie. And so that shared experience of watching a movie together, of going on a journey together, and then talking about the issues at the heart of it. I knew that first night that this was going to be my next book. And I emailed my editor at Oxford University Press that night, and I said, I can't tell you exactly what it's going to look like, but I know that the next book is going to be about race and film and conversation. And ultimately, what I wanted to do was to go on and build conversations in a conscious way that would sort of ripple out from the places where we held them. And that's exactly what happened during the 4 years that I worked on this book. And I learned so much in the process. And I feel like these were transformational conversations for a lot of people who witnessed them as well. That ripple imagery is something that has stayed with me. And often I would sort of wander out after one of these events and follow people down a city street, and they would still be talking about the movie. And I just hoped, it's like, this is a conversation that started here and it's going to go home with you and it back into your neighborhood and back into your workplace.
So, I mean, there's so much in what you just said. I think it just, when you mentioned that you didn't know what shape the book was going to take at first, I want to say just one thing about the shape the book did ultimately take. And I didn't mention the subtitle at the beginning. The title is A Long, Long Way, but the subtitle is Hollywood's Unfinished Journey from Racism to Reconciliation. So this book is not a history of race in American film. You mentioned that there have been other people who've written on this subject. The way you craft this book, you even write about this quite a bit, like how much these conversations that you've had have shaped your own reflection about these films and about the issues that they raise. But also the book itself kind of serves as a kind of catalyst for further conversation for the reader and the viewer of a film. So you take roughly, let's see, my math isn't so good, 6 films, is that right?
Yep.
Starting with The Birth of a Nation, Casablanca, which is kind of an interesting inclusion, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Do the Right Thing, Crash, and Get Out. So you cover, it's not, you say this isn't a book of sort of film history, but you cover basically like the span of film history, especially American film history.
Right.
And
right.
From the beginning, when I think Birth of a Nation kind of marks one kind of beginning, at least, it's not the first film ever made, but it's certainly the first really, really big film, all the way up to the present day. So I told you earlier that having 4 boys has somewhat hampered my film viewing capacity these days. I could talk to you a lot. We could talk a lot about Pixar films and Miyazaki, maybe, but I haven't even seen Get Out, so I should say that at the beginning. But why these? Did I get the math right? Why these 6 films? What was it about the particular ones that you thought?
I think one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to wrestle with Hollywood's treatment of race and representation. And again, as you said, it's not a history book per se, although there is history in it, because like we're moving from Birth of a Nation in 1915 to Get Out a couple of years ago. But what I really wanted to do, and this actually was another thing that came out of a public conversation, I am really interested in our racial mythologies. And as I think I mentioned in an email with you recently, that's the project I'm working on now, is like a bigger, like more broad-based exploration of white racial mythologies, and how white people have thought about people of color, particularly Black people, and expressed that in political discourse and religious discourse and pop culture and material culture and advertising and all these other kinds of things. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to do some exploration of racial mythologies and how Hollywood has dealt with them. And I was having a conversation in a progressive Baptist church in Dallas. And if you can put all of those words together in your head, there is a progressive Baptist church in Dallas, Wilshire Baptist Church, where I've been several times to screen some films and do some of these conversations. And I was having a conversation. I'm not going to say on stage, because in a church you're not on stage, but up on the dais with the pastor during worship one weekend when I was there leading a retreat. And between the two of us in conversation, we came up with the idea that what I was really doing was trying to identify and hold up to the light these harmful mythologies in American culture. Sort of like we were saying about George Floyd, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And like once you pull something out of the darkness and hold it up, then it's impossible to go back to the way you were before, unless you choose to be willfully ignorant. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to explore and expose those harmful racial mythologies, to pull them up out of our dark cellar and expose them to the light in hopes that we would be able to reckon with them and repent of them, to use some theological language. And then I also wanted to acknowledge and celebrate the tiny victories along the way for Hollywood and the ways that they helped advance and are helping advance a more positive set of racial mythologies, often turning those old mythologies on their heads.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the idea of starting with Birth of a Nation, it is ground zero for our hateful racial mythology. Henry Louis Gates, in his most recent book, actually talks about this as the sort of epitome of the redemption period of Southern history, where we can't have slavery anymore, but we will do everything we can to turn back the clock and reestablish our hierarchies. And so all of the different mythologies that are still expressed by white supremacists. In the book, I talk about basically you can't understand the white supremacists in Charlottesville in 2017 if you don't understand Birth of a Nation, because it's ground zero for our cultural understanding of negative racial mythology.
And so let me ask you like a personal question. At what point in your life did you see Birth of a Nation for the first time?
It was actually fairly recently.
Mm-hmm.
We did not study it in my film classes, which is not astonishing.
Yeah.
Because it is a really hard movie to teach. When Spike Lee studied it, he said that what they tended to do was just talk about the aesthetics. And you can't just talk about the aesthetics. I mean, James Baldwin talked about how it was a work of artistic genius and an incitement to genocide. And both of those things have to be talked about. You can't just talk about it as a Hollywood landmark and D.W. Griffith as a storytelling master. You've got to also deal with the hateful mythology. So it's probably maybe 15 years ago that I saw it for the first time. And I've been teaching it for about the last 10 years. And as I point out in the book, I teach it, but I also teach it with a very highly contextualized set of conversations. So kind of in the same way that HBO pulled Gone with the Wind off their streaming service this summer and, brought in an African-American historian critic to give a little bit of, and it really is just a little bit of context, but just enough to say, slavery actually probably was not as much fun as Gone with the Wind makes it seem.
Yeah.
So the other thing about teaching this work is that it engenders some really good, hard conversations at the very beginning of a semester, because this is typically the first film we watch. And as you pointed out, this is the beginning of Hollywood history. This is the first important Hollywood feature film. It establishes the model for what Hollywood is going to be all the way down to the present. It makes it reputable for middle class and upper class Americans to go to the theater and watch movies. It's got an incredible cultural currency. Everybody's talking about it. So it was a blockbuster film before we knew what blockbusters were. And it was important in every way that we understand cultural works to be important. So popular, critically acclaimed, culturally relevant, and hateful. And so when you can put all those things together, if you can hold that tension together, which is what I try and do in class, what we actually end up being able to talk about is how the brilliance of Griffith's directing actually makes the racial mythologies that much more potent. We are sucked in to the movie and the editing and the music. This was the first feature film that had its own dedicated score. The acting, just all of those things that make a movie a powerful emotional experience can suck you in and make you complicit. It reminds me a lot of, there's a classic work about the English poet John Milton by the American critic Stanley Fish called Surprised by Sin. And in that book, which is a book of reader response criticism, Fish talks about how Milton over and over again sort of baits a trap for the reader to make the reader identify with Satan. And in a very real sense, not for the same reasons, because Milton actually had a noble pedagogical goal, but it's the very same thing that Griffith is doing. And there's this famous story, I mention it in the book, and it's probably not true, but it's one of those things that if it's not true, it ought to be, that a bunch of these Soviet filmmakers came over to America and visited Hollywood, and they were going to be shown Birth of a Nation as sort of the highest flower of American achievement. And they were like, oh, we have heard about this movie and it's terrible racial attitudes. And, we are sure we will not enjoy it. And then as the story goes, you get to the end of the movie and the Ku Klux Klan is riding to the rescue through the night and white womanhood is being menaced, and we're cross-cutting back and forth between all of these stories, and your breathing gets exaggerated and your heart rate goes up. And the story goes that these Russian filmmakers jumped to their feet cheering for the Ku Klux Klan. And whether or not it's true, that story reflects the power that a work of art can have in shaping or confirming people's racial attitudes. If you were not sure how you felt about Black people when you walked into Birth of a Nation, you were absolutely sure when you walked out.
When reading and hearing your narration of that story, which I love, and reading your account of this, the response to the film reminded me of a passage from St. Augustine in Confessions when he's describing the theater. And it was, I wish I knew this from memory, but I got my copy out so I could read it to you. See if this is sort of on the same page. He says, describing an experience of going to the theater. It's from book 3 of the Confessions. A member of the audience is not excited to offer help, but invited only to grieve. The greater his pain, the greater his approval of the actor in these representations. If the human calamities, whether in ancient histories or fictitious myths, are so presented that the theatergoer is not caused pain, he walks out of the theater disgusted and highly critical. But if he feels pain, he stays riveted in his seat, enjoying himself.
Yeah.
It goes on for a couple of pages in this vein, and this sort of critique of the theater as a kind of spectacle where you love the pain that it creates for you, but making that connection to, I guess maybe what we would call empathy now, or it doesn't occasion for Augustine some kind of existential crisis in the way that now we might look at a film like Birth of a Nation and go, or put ourselves in the position of the Soviet filmmakers who are like, yeah, I'm not going to respond that way to the film. But the power of power of this particular work and I guess any good work of film, is to evoke that same kind of almost delight in pain
Hmm.
that Augustine's talking about. Is that kind of, I mean, was what Augustine's saying there sort of similar to what Fish is talking about? And
I think it's along the same lines, and it's also very much Augustine. I think is quoted about 8 or 10 times in this book, which is not much for me. But there were not as many places where I could bring Augustine in, and I was also trying to rely a lot more on African American theologians, as you know, as appropriate for a reflection on racism and reconciliation. I think that what we can carry out of Augustine's thinking about the theater, because one of the things that we know also from the Confessions is he felt like many of these pagan works had been leading him in the direction of God, but not all of them. And so one of the things that I argue in this book is that it's important to watch these films with discernment. And I mean, this is true of anything we consume. Like I discovered that Mad Men and Breaking Bad made me feel terrible. Like it deprived my soul of something instead of feeding it. And not everybody had that experience. I've got pastor and priest friends who loved those shows. But it was very clear to me that I needed to not watch that, because for whatever reason it was harmful to me rather than helpful. It was depleting me rather than feeding me. And I think that we come back to these films with discernment when we can read them in their context and understand, you know, what they were trying to communicate and what the racial attitudes of the time were. And if we can find a place to celebrate, you know, a progressive movement forward on race, that's one of the reasons I picked Casablanca. Most people don't think about race in Casablanca as being a sort of central feature of it because, you know, the Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman romance is so central to it. But I hope that the chapter is convincing. And the other choice would have been Gone with the Wind, which, you know, we also could talk a lot about. But I felt like after I'd talked about Birth of a Nation, I had also talked about Gone with the Wind.
yeah,
it's another of those films that if you watch it, you know, it is another of those sort of great defenders of the lost cause myth. And it necessarily is going to create these hierarchies in the way it depicts racial mythology.
so let's back up for a minute, because it's possible that there's somebody in the audience who hasn't seen Birth of a Nation. And it was probably around the same time when I first saw it. I mean, I think it was around 2000. I really have a vivid memory of watching it when we were in Durham, and frankly, completely misunderstanding the film. I mean, I think I read it in a pretty terrible way, but that's another story. So in like 2 sentences, what is Birth of a Nation? I mean, could you give us like a thumbs?
Sure. Yeah, Birth of a Nation is an adaptation of a novel by the racist clergyman Thomas Dixon, who was a friend of Woodrow Wilson's, and this was actually the first film ever to be shown at the White House, which is another story we could also probably talk about. But it's a Civil War and Reconstruction epic, and you might expect that in a Civil War and Reconstruction epic, Birth of a Nation is about the new nation that's formed after the Civil War. But it becomes very clear toward the end of the film that that new nation that's being formed is an Aryan nation of Northern and Southern white men in resistance to and response to this temporary elevation of people of color. So the very, very simple plot, it goes on for hours and hours, but there are two families, one in the north or in DC, one in the south. The brothers know each other from boarding school. There are these all sorts of Dickensian connections between the families and sort of crossing love affairs. And the hero is a character, the little colonel, who is wounded in battle and meets the daughter of the northern family and falls in love with her. And ultimately, he becomes, instead of Nathan Bedford Forrest, he becomes the person who starts the Ku Klux Klan. And it is this heroic organization that are taking back the South for white people. And at the end of the film, we were just referring to it, the most famous scene, it's usually scored to Ride of the Valkyries. The Ku Klux Klan rides to the assistance of these white women and their families who are being attacked by bestial black men, black soldiers. And they come, they save the day. And at the end, there's these sort of crazy, I don't even know what to call them, epilogues, which is basically, you know, everything is okay and Jesus is happy with the way things turned out. God is in his heaven and all is right with the world. So that is, you know, my 1 minute summary of, you know, the 3 hours.
Yeah, well done. That was just a Herculean task. So I mean, there's so many kind of cultural dynamics going on in the film itself, but there's also a lot of cultural dynamic going on in kind of popular American awareness of or understanding of the film.
Yeah.
So the fact that most people haven't seen Birth of a Nation is itself not particularly surprising, because the film was made in 1915. It's a silent film, more or less. I mean, you've got to read, you gotta read titles and stuff.
You have to pay attention.
Pay attention for a long, it was like 3 hours. I mean, it's very long.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I don't know if ignorance is the right word, but lack of knowledge of the film overlaps with an equally widespread ignorance about its subject matter, which is basically the period of Reconstruction. And we've talked about this in here a couple times before, about how, you know, this period from the end of the Civil War until, let's say, 1915, roughly the First World War. That, I mean, I didn't know anything about that period from high school and college. And what I think my initial reaction to Birth of a Nation was because I knew nothing about this period, I frankly found it hard to believe that a film that appeared to be celebrating the Klan and depicting African Americans in this like grotesquely stereotypical and negative way, that a film like that could be taken seriously on its own terms. So I kind of had some really terrible reading of the film as a sort of, because I was naive about history, naive about like the idea of, well, you couldn't just make a film sort of brazenly celebrating the Klan in 1915. Well, not only could you make a film with a lot of funding, but it become a blockbuster, and it become hugely popular and celebrated as, yes, a work of art, but also as a work of history.
Yeah.
So you talk about this too, the way the film becomes received, partly because of the brilliant way in which Griffith authorizes his own version of history through some very clever means. It becomes received as history. And I discovered a while back, not very recently, that when the film premiered in Atlanta, it was in, I think, December 6th, 1915. So months after it premiered elsewhere. But the Atlanta Constitution ran a huge spread, 2-page spread featuring like glowing reviews about this film from all over the country. You've probably seen like this one or others in other papers, you know, about how, and there was one quote from the president of the Atlanta chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy saying basically, finally, our version of history is being vindicated and things are being shown as they were.
Yeah.
And there's, you know, the lost cause language is invoked and stuff. But at the same issue of that, the same issue of the Atlanta Constitution, in which there was that glowing spread for Birth of a Nation, was a little announcement, really small, you could miss it, that the day before, the state of Georgia had issued an official charter for the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And so the revival of the Klan is also directly related to this film. So this was a case of like a film having real world sort of consequences. In fact, you know that this about the whole cross burning thing that we associate with the Klan was invented by D.W. Griffith for the movie. And then the Klan thought it was a cool thing to do, so they stole it. So it's this weird way of like film influencing culture and vice versa. But I kind of approached this movie the first time I saw it with a complete ignorance of history.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also, I don't know if that, I guess what I'm going with this is, when you're bringing this film up and you're teaching this to your students or to retreats and you're showing this, and you're introducing them to, on the one hand, a period of history that most of us were taught very little about.
Right.
But you're also giving them at the same time a sort of openly biased version of that history.
Yeah.
So it's a lot to untangle when you're teaching this.
I think one of the things that I would do is I would pull forward, you were talking about the Daughters of Confederacy endorsement of the film. And, you know, this is roughly contemporaneous with all of the monuments and plaques and with the Jackson and Lee windows in the National Cathedral, all of these things the Daughters of the Confederacy are doing as they are trying to cement the lost cause narrative as the version of history that's going to get taught, if it gets taught at all. And I think that that's exactly what's happening here. You know, it doesn't have a, you know, like a Daughters of the Confederacy plaque on it, but it is very much the version of history that they would like you to believe is history, both in terms of the noble white characters and their reasons for what they do, the racial mythologies about how Black people can't be trusted to rule themselves, let alone a state or be part of a government. They shouldn't even be trusted to vote. And that's something that's made very clear in Birth of a Nation, and it's enacted in Jim Crow laws across the South. But it becomes a dramatic way for us to see how those things get justified and tied into an official history of the South. And you were mentioning that Griffith does that in a number of ways. He quotes Woodrow Wilson's History of America in a number of title cards. And in the book, I point out that there are a number of other places where he is using authentic sort of touches as a way of sort of establishing that this thing that you are watching is what actually happened. I mean, it's all made up, you know, almost every piece of it. I mean, Lincoln did get shot. That actually did happen. But everything else, you know, in all these characters, some of them are based on, you know, sort of real life characters, but the arc of the story, you know, the idea of the predatory Black men, the Black Northern soldiers running amok in the Southern town. I mean, all of those things are simply in service of this story and this lost cause mythology that helps to explain why white people need to remain on top of the pyramid and Black people need to remain, in their positions. And it's a painful watch for people of color. And you remember from your time at Baylor that Baylor is pretty remarkably diverse. And so typically in a class, I will have all kinds of people sitting there, and there will be all kinds of painful reactions. This year, as we're talking a lot about white supremacy and white privilege, and there's a best-selling book by a white writer called White Fragility. I can tell you, after doing this for 4 years, white people have a different response, and they put up their barriers, and people of color have a different response, and often it's painful and triggers things for them. And it becomes necessary for us to have conversation about, how did you perceive this, and what did this feel like to you? And that is the complicated thing. And that's why this movie doesn't get taught very much. It doesn't get watched very much. It is, at least theoretically, still in Turner Classic Movies rotation, but they get protests every time they show it, as they probably should, because without a context, it's one of the most offensive things you will ever watch. And yet, as I was saying, it feels to me like we have got to acknowledge this history and learn our history in order to move forward. And when we talk maybe about Black Klansmen and Get Out later on, and we talk about how Black filmmakers are sort of taking Hollywood tropes and genres and turning them on their heads as a way of moving us toward justice. I think that one of the great conversations is the thing that you've just been talking about, which is, I didn't know anything about this period. And we were talking earlier, this is smack dab in the period of lynchings, from the 1870s, up into the 1820s after World War I. And we were talking about a character, well, not a character. He's a person who is mentioned in Spike Lee's Black Klansman, Jesse Washington. And toward the end of Black Klansman, there are two groups talking about or seeing Birth of a Nation. There's a group of Klan people watching the movie at a Klan initiation and cheering it on. And then there's a Black student group talking to somebody from Waco, Texas, who witnessed his best friend, Jesse Washington, get lynched as a result of Birth of a Nation. And my research found that is actually, you can't say causal, but Birth of a Nation was shown often in Waco, Texas in 1915 and 1916. It stoked all of these attitudes. There are a number of lynchings depicted in the movie. And I think that Spike Lee and his screenwriters are absolutely right to say that this is a contributory factor. The NAACP also felt that way. They organized boycotts and marches against the film around the country. And so just as it was responsible for relaunching the Ku Klux Klan, the modern Ku Klux Klan atop Stone Mountain outside of Atlanta, it also was responsible for this incredible growth of the NAACP into this civil rights juggernaut. And so again, if we're celebrating the good and lamenting the bad, the good is that there were a bunch of people of good conscience, of all colors, who said, I cannot stand by and say nothing when this is the most popular movie in the land, and these attitudes and mythologies are being reflected in such a powerful way.
So when you're teaching this to mixed, racially mixed group of students, how do you create the space for students to feel, safe talking about a movie like this that is bound to bring up like pretty strong emotions? That assumes like how do you establish a trust with your students at the beginning of the semester, so you hit them with the Birth of a Nation?
Yeah, and so this is usually the second or third week into my film class. And I will tell you, what I try to do is I try to be very intentional pedagogically and pastorally in how I set up the class. And I'm sure some of you who teach do this very thing. But what I tell them is that we're going to talk about really serious things about the entire spectrum of human experience, and that I want them to know that they're absolutely safe in this space. The few ground rules that I set, you are absolutely open to express your emotions. you cannot say something that will be hurtful to somebody else in this room or outside of this room based on who they are or what they look like or who they love. You know, so I set like some ground rules about what is not allowed. And then I just say, this is a safe space, and I'm going to do everything within my power to make sure that you are heard and acknowledged. And then from that first day, I try and give them a lot of opportunities to talk to each other. Because if what we're going to do is talk across these divides, then they have to kind of get to know each other as humans, as opposed to stereotypes. And so there's just a lot of intentionality about it. And when we watch the film, I also just sort of warn them. It's like, this is going to be a really challenging conversation. And I want you to understand that. I know it. And you're going to have all sorts of feels. The movie expects you to. I expect you to. And please trust me that we're going to have a conversation that is going to leave us in a better place than it started. And so there is also just, frankly, I'm asking them to take a lot on trust. Yeah. And, you know, thankfully, it always works. And, you know, part of it's 31 years in the classroom. You sort of develop this ability to carry along a conversation and to see who needs to talk and where people are. And then the other thing is, like, you know, that you also sort of develop a reputation on campus. And so if I have a reputation, I mean, the two things I'm famous for at Baylor, nobody at Baylor has been divorced more often than I have. So at a formerly Baptist university, that's a distinction. It's not, you know, being the Mickey Rooney of Baylor is not the thing that I set out to do when I became an academic, but that just sort of accidentally happened along the way. And then the other thing is, if you want to learn something about the world outside of literature or film, then this is a class you should take. And so I get a lot of self-selecting from people who come in with the intention of engagement. And that's another thing, just having taught there so long, that you develop a little bit of a reputation where people will trust that, as difficult as this is going to be, we're going to have a really meaningful exchange of ideas, and I'm going to feel safe, and I'm going to be heard. And I'm not going to leave the classroom, you know, feeling damaged by what happened. So
what would you say to a student or somebody who maybe was thinking about a retreat on film that said, well, I just don't want to have those feels. Like, I'm just not interested in having those emotions brought up. Like, how would you say to convince someone of the importance of confronting something like Birth of a Nation, or confronting American history through Birth of a Nation? To get them.
And the first thing, there's two things there. First, I would not show this at a retreat because it's just too damn long.
Yeah.
To expect people to have the energy and the attention for this, and as difficult as it is, it would pull away from the entire rest of whatever it is that we did together over a weekend or a week. But in response to that question, I don't want to feel this. There's a story that I tell in the book, and it's a story about Get Out. So, like, we're jumping far ahead at this moment, but I did something with the Episcopal Cathedral and with their Peace and Justice folks in downtown Houston a year or two ago. And I had some African-American pastors who were my onstage conversation partners. And there were some people who were there for the entire weekend. And so we watched, I think, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner on Friday, and Do the Right Thing on Saturday morning. And we were going to watch Get Out on Saturday afternoon. And there was this elderly woman who came up to me during the break after Do the Right Thing. And she said, I don't think I'm going to be able to watch the third movie. I've never watched a horror film, and I'm really frightened. And I don't think that I'm going to be able to do it. And I said, you know, I absolutely understand if you don't feel like you're capable of doing it. I do want to tell you that it will be worth it. The growth and the understanding that you get from watching this movie is going to be worth the discomfort that comes with watching it. And by that point, we had built up a little bit of trust, and she was like, okay, I will watch it. And so she watched it, you know, largely like this. And then after the movie, my friend Sean Palmer and I were talking about it on stage. And we were talking about how it's a movie that you have to see more than once, because it is a movie that is full of irony, and you cannot watch it the same way after having seen how it ends. There are all of these secrets and Easter eggs and things that Jordan Peele has planted in them, and you're like, oh my God, I didn't see that. That's brilliant. Now I understand, you know? And so we were talking about how you need to see it more than once. And this woman is sitting in the front row, just shaking her head violently and mouthing up at me, no, no, I can't. And then after we had finished, and after we'd had this really powerful conversation with a room full of people from all over Houston, all sorts of, all sorts of different racial and cultural and ethnic representation, she came up to me and she said, I'm going to watch that movie again. I don't want to, but I need to. I live in a racist culture and I want to understand everything I can about how to make it better. And that is the story I would tell. And then the denouement to the story just makes it that much better, because, you know, this is a book covering 100 years of Hollywood history, right? And so afterwards, somebody from the Cathedral's Peace and Justice group comes up to me and said, do you know who you've been talking to? And I said, no, I don't know. Just, a lovely, brave woman is all I know. And so she told me her name, and it was this matriarch of Houston society. And she said, it's amazing that she committed to watch the movie at all. That woman is 100 years old. And I said, she what? And I was like, okay, so Birth of a Nation to Get Out. Like during her lifetime, that whole spectrum gets represented. And so what I would say is, to somebody who has some reluctance, that discomfort is an essential part, that cognitive dissonance that we might feel as we wrestle with the mythologies that have been established in our heads. I remember the first time I saw this documentary called Ethnic Notions, an Emmy Award-winning documentary that takes a look at how Black people have been presented in popular culture historically. And I was just stunned and hurt, and also trampled by the truth. And it's like so many light bulb moments for me. And the other story that I'll tell about Get Out, because if people are nervous about any of these films, and many of them are powerful and difficult, even the shorter ones, even the more popular ones like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which seems frothy on its surface and isn't. One of my students from Baylor accompanied me. We usually bring about 5 students to this race and film festival we do at Washington National Cathedral. And so this was, and I try very hard not to deal in stereotypes, but there is a stereotype of a certain sort of Baylor co-ed who comes from money and has had, how can I put this? Every sort of difficulty in her life cushioned for her. And I loved her completely, and I invited her to be a part of this experience because I knew it would be a good experience for her. And she was crazy smart and willing to learn. And I want to get all that out there. But this whole notion of racial mythology and racial healing was not really anything that she had thought about before the class we had together. And so she watched Get Out. And at the end of the movie, we were sitting together in the second row of the nave of the cathedral, and she turned to me and she was just weeping, just tears streaming down her face. And she said, I've never before understood what we do to Black people. I'm like, okay, there it is. That life-changing moment does not happen without her watching Jordan Peele's movie. And that is where I would leave that. I usually don't get invited by people who don't want me to do what I do. So that's the nice thing. I rarely have to deal with that. But it is an important thing. And I always try and talk about that at the beginning of a weekend or a beginning of a screening. There are going to be some hard things, and we're going to talk about them. So, don't fear that you're just going to be sitting there suffering in silence. We're going to address these things and get to them in a way that I hope will be powerful and healing.
Which echoes the trajectory of your book, which, as I mentioned in the subtitle, is is leading towards reconciliation. and you have, you know, that's where it sounds to me like the goal of this kind of work is understanding, like you just described,
Yeah.
something that you were unaware of before, and also whatever the next step is, a repentance, reconciliation, etc.
Yeah.
So we've kind of bookended the whole story from Birth of a Nation to Get Out. So could
Yeah.
you, and I know some folks probably want to jump in here too. So what are the other steps that you also trace,
Good.
that
Yeah.
like 6 stages of America's disposition towards Black people in
Yeah.
film, from Birth of a
Yeah.
Nation
And
to Get Out, and then how does that story change and evolve over
good.
the?
Good. Yeah, and I can do that pretty quickly, which is the nice thing, because this was one of the first things that fell together for me. There were a lot of things that had to come out of conversations and realizations that I had on stage with other folks, and um, but the thing, just from a film historical standpoint, it's easy to do a comparison between Birth of a Nation and Get Out. I mean, there's this clear arc, and you start with this place of, you know, abject racism. And I also talk about in this book, although I don't talk much about representative films because it's representative of absence. But from Birth of a Nation on into well into the 40s and 50s, most mainstream Hollywood films were almost completely or completely white. So the example that I think I give in the book is Buster Keaton's The General, which is a Civil War epic that takes place, you know, roughly contemporaneously with the film setting of Birth of a Nation. And a question that I always have for my students when we watch that film is, do you see any Black people in the South, in Buster Keaton's South? And every now and then we'll go, well, maybe back there at the back of the frame. But what we're looking at the beginning of Hollywood history is either this terrifying racism or simply the absence of representation. And as I point out, Barry Jenkins, the director of Moonlight and If Beale Street Could Talk, says, if you don't see yourself represented, it's as if you don't exist. And Malcolm X talks about this, James Baldwin talks about this. There's a lot of cultural criticism about how essential it is that you see yourself. And I also tell some stories from my friend Kelly Brown Douglas, the great African-American theologian, who talks about how powerful it was to see Sidney Poitier on screen in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Like, for the first time in her life, she felt like she existed. So we start off in this place of real brokenness in terms of how Hollywood depicts people of color. And the point that I make is I focus in the book on the depiction of Black people, but it could be true of just about everybody outside the white male Protestant mainstream. So we could talk about the depiction of women, or the depiction of LGBTQ people, or of Hispanic people, or of other ethnic groups. I mean, it's just, but thankfully there's also this trajectory in all of those ways as well, with almost every other group I can think of. So the second phase, which is represented by Casablanca, I also talk a little bit about Gone with the Wind, is minor supporting roles in which Black characters are invested with more humanity. And often it has something to do with the dignity and strength of the actor or actress playing them. If somebody besides Hattie McDaniel had played Mammy, it could have been a very different representation. But she played Mammy, Dooley Wilson played Sam, as somebody with an inner life, somebody with strength and dignity. Both of them stand up to their employers. There is, and in fact, I mentioned that African-American newspapers thought that Dooley Wilson's Sam was by far the most realistic depiction of an African-American on screen at the time that Casablanca came out. So it's a baby step, but it is a step. And Hollywood has often been a little more progressive than the culture in terms of how it deals with race and difference. Then the next big step is obviously bigger roles for people of color. And Sidney Poitier is just like the sort of great shining light of this in the 50s and 60s. And he's a marquee, you know, above the title name. And these are still movies made by white filmmakers, written by white screenwriters. They don't have an absolute understanding of the culture and and the sorts of struggles that this character may have faced. But at least these are films that tend to have some recognition of race. And, you know, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and In the Heat of the Night may seem a little reductive and simple to us now, but for 1967, they're pretty crazy progressive. So that's a third phase. The fourth phase, and the obvious one, is when people of color start making and starring and directing and producing their own films. And there had been Black films all the way back into the teens, but they were made for Black audiences, and they weren't seen by white mainstream audiences. And so you get Spike Lee, John Singleton, and then all the way to today with Ryan Coogler and Ava DuVernay. You get people telling their own stories and being allowed to represent themselves. And that's, of course, what all of us hope, you know, that our story is going to be heard and we're going to be seen. And then the phase after that that's represented by Crash is what I like to call casual multiculturalism. In the 60s and 70s, it was momentous if you had a Black character. And Crash is a movie, it's set in contemporary LA, it's multi-ethnic, and it's not made a big deal of. I mean, racism and prejudice are its subject, but it's not, you know, look, here's a Black person, here's a Hispanic person, here's an Asian person. And we see that a whole lot in blockbuster films now. So you get this in Star Wars films and in Marvel films, a little bit in DC films. It is no longer such a big deal that people of color find themselves cast in these roles. And I also talk a little bit about Hamilton, which is just, you know, this crazy, wondrous example of countercultural casting, where Lin-Manuel Miranda said, well, my George Washington is Black, and he's going to have nobility and dignity and strength, but he's Black. And like, nobody bats an eye. It's like, yeah, this actually makes history come to life for so many more people. And then the last phase that's represented by Get Out. I also talk about Black Klansman, which is a film that I teach and screen a lot. But here is a period where we have great filmmakers working at the height of their craft, using Hollywood stories and genres and tropes, but turning them on their heads so that they're no longer vehicles of racism, but they become vehicles to allow us to understand racism. So just in a very brief way, Get Out is a social horror film. It is a remake of sorts to Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. A white woman brings home her Black boyfriend to meet her family, and things go very badly from that point. A very different kind of badly than in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And so there are a couple of horror movie tropes that I will just mention to you that I will not spoil the movie, but you will, if you know anything about cinema history of the last 30 or 40 years. Typically there is a trope in horror films, and in fact in most mainstream Hollywood films, called first man out. If there is a Black character in a movie, that is typically the first person to die. And when we were doing one of these programs at the National Cathedral, NPR's Corva Coleman was our moderator. And she was rewatching Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and her teenage daughter just walked through the living room, and she saw Sidney Poitier, who of course is the star of the film. And she said, when does he die? And so first man out is a horror movie trope that Jordan Peele turns on its head. And I'm not going to tell you how he does that. The white virgin is the other horror movie trope. You know, if you saw Halloween or any of the slasher films that followed it, it's usually the virginal high school girl who survives to be, you know, haunted by the killer in the sequel. So the white virgin is another trope that Jordan Peele plays with. And it's also, you know, I said that this is a book about sex. Many of these films are about miscegenation, about interracial relationships. And of course, Birth of a Nation is saying this is the most awful thing that could happen. And Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is saying, well, this is happening, so maybe we should try and get our heads around it. And then what Get Out is saying is maybe we have thought about this wrong the whole time. So those are the phases that I look at. And people often ask me in interviews like this, where do I think we're going after this? And I'm not really sure. I think that probably the big things are going to be in terms of how we recognize people of color There's been a big movement over the last couple of years, particularly in award shows like the Oscars, to see why more people of color are not represented. This year's Primetime Emmys did an amazing job of being radically inclusive. But there have been several years where very few, if any, people of color were nominated in major categories of the Oscars. And so I think that's kind of our bellwether. What do the Oscars look like? What do the awards look like? And the fact that something like Moonlight could win Best Picture, which surprised everybody, including the people from La La Land who were already on stage accepting their award, does say to me that we are moving in a good direction. But I always come back to that title, which is from something that Martin Luther King often said when he was asked about racial progress. And he would say, we've come a long, long way, and we still have a long way to go. And so I think that's where we are. Obviously, when we look from 1915 to the present, we've come a long way. But there is still progress to be made. And the last chapter of the book is actually what can we do knowing what we now know about ourselves from watching and discussing these films. And so I talk about some of the changes that have really come to light during 2020 as a result of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter marches. But, how do we reckon with our racist history? How do we get to reconciliation? And I quote a bunch of people who I've had the chance to talk to over this, who basically say white people want to get directly to reconciliation. It's like, oh, I see what we did wrong. Okay, I see what we did wrong. Is that it? Are we done here? And of course, we're not done here. So there is this very strong sense that it's a process of ongoing conversation. And one of the folks that I talked to who does this work for the National Episcopal Church says that people want this to be a sprint when it's actually a marathon. But you can't have the conversation and you can't work toward reconciliation and healing until you've acknowledged what's happened. And so I talk about Georgetown University's history of slave holding and slave selling. I talk about the Civil War windows at the National Cathedral and their decision to remove those windows given by the Daughters of the Confederacy. And more recently, I've been, I don't want to take too much credit because there have been a lot of people who have seen that this was the right thing to do, but I have been pushing for the last couple of years for Baylor University, one of the few antebellum universities west of the Mississippi, to reckon with its slaveholding past and its history of racism. And again, it's just this sort of thing, you've got to hold it up to the light and acknowledge it and say, yes, we did this and it was wrong and I am sorry. And I want to know how to make it better. Let's talk. So that is kind of my goal. And that's led me in the direction of where I'm going now with this big project on white racial mythologies that has sort of grown exponentially to consume not just my bedroom, but my entire life.
So I want to give anybody else who's in the Zoom a chance to jump in. So if you have something you'd like to ask Greg about, let me know. I think you can put your hand up with a little thing or wave if you're on your video. While you're doing that and thinking of something you want to talk about, what you just said, Greg, made me think about somebody who I know you're teaching this week, and his name's above your left shoulder. And I'm hearing a lot of what you're describing, reflect what I've heard in Baldwin's work too. Is this particularly when James Baldwin is addressing white America?
Yeah.
And what I think Baldwin was, very observant that what you just named is this kind of jumping from, as theological language we might say, like from Good Friday to Easter Sunday, like really quickly. or that move from recognition insofar as it's achieved to reconciliation without the work of reparation or the work of repentance,
Yeah.
or whatever Baldwin's language would probably be slightly
Yeah.
different.
However we want to understand that.
Yeah. But so I know that you've been reading a lot of Baldwin recently too, and you're teaching him this week. And so you mentioned this before, that like all these things are kind of coming together this week for you. And instead
Yeah.
of talking about film, talking about Baldwin has, but again, like Baldwin was sort of like, for me, Birth of a Nation. I didn't I didn't sort of really begin to read Baldwin seriously until pretty embarrassingly recently. He was another one of
Yeah.
those figures who, like in my education, was not ever assigned or ever taught. And
Yeah.
and you can kind of understand why that is, because it's like when you talked about this at the very beginning, like once you see some, like with respect to the George Floyd video, once you see that, you cannot unsee it.
Yeah.
Baldwin as a writer is, for me, very much like that. Like he shows
Yeah.
you a reality that you can no longer unsee
Yeah.
without a heroic act of deliberate, willful ignorance.
Yeah.
So could you get, like, in a minute or two, tell us like your relationship to Baldwin, like how reading him, like where did you come to start reckoning with his work, and how is it?
Yeah. My very close relationship with Baldwin is also fairly recent.
Yeah.
I had read the short stories, I'd read some of the essays, and usually when I taught a person from this period, I would teach Dr. King. And I had done that for many years, and I've taught American Lit, probably once a year for 30 years. And so I try to be as representative as I can in terms of the authors that I pick, and um, I always want to have somebody who is wrestling with the civil rights issues that are still current with us. And for all those years, I dived deep into Dr. King, because after I came back to faith, I found him even more interesting. When I was outside of the faith tradition, I used to say that Dr. King was the only Christian I could be in the same room with. And so coming back to him and recognizing how much of his justice work grew out of his faith was an essential part of my own growth as I came back to faith. And so I continued to kind of live in Dr. King's world for a long time. But then I just started seeing these connections and intersections where James Baldwin kept coming into what I was reading and what I was thinking about. And so probably 5 years ago, I picked up The Fire Next Time, read it for the first time. It has not been out of my backpack since. Like, I have carried it across the world. I carried it to Switzerland last summer, to the tiny village in the Alps, and endured a harrowing ride up the side of a mountain because I wanted to see this place where James Baldwin had written Go Tell It on the Mountain. And one of his seminal essays, which is called Stranger in a Village, which is the first place where he realizes that Black people and white people are going to have to solve this problem, to live in that in-between, the Holy Saturday, because we can't divorce each other. So I can come, he said, as a Black person to this tiny village in Switzerland and be the only person of color they've ever seen, and I can go away. I don't belong here. And they don't have to reckon with my Blackness. They don't have to deal with who I am, because I'm not going to be here. I'm going to leave. But when I go back, if I come back to America, I am back in this where we are literally family. Literally family. And so the big thing that has been important for me with Baldwin is that idea of history, which is so fundamental to his understanding. And he writes about it in The Fire Next Time, and he writes about it in lots of other places. But basically he tells his nephew that white people are trapped in their history. And until they learn it and acknowledge it, then they can't move forward. And that's part of why, Baldwin is going to be with me for the next 5 years. As I do this white racial mythologies work, and as I try and help white churches learn something about what it means to act with racial justice. So Baldwin is, I've got a saint's candle given by one of my favorite students, who knows how much I admire and have learned from him. And that is exactly how I think of him. I mean, the job of the saints is to teach us and to model a faithful life. And as he says at the beginning of the first collection of essays, he said, I want to be a good writer and a good man. And I mean, on every level, that's the vocation that I think that he sets out and he asks us to aspire to.
So we've got a few minutes for anyone else to jump in if you would like. If you want to ask a question, please show us your face if you have a device that has a camera on it, and do join this conversation. I have to say,
I would love a question from the floor. If anybody has something that they really want to ask or get out here in the.
Yeah, and if you want to type it in the chat, I guess you could do that too, but I'll give a minute to anybody who wants to.
Well, I was trying to recall the name of the person who talked about sprint and marathon. And so I had to check my notes real quick because I've forgotten everything in 2020. I barely remember my own name. Catherine Meeks, Dr. Catherine Meeks, is in charge of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Reconciliation that's run in Atlanta. And she does things for the National Episcopal Church. And she was one of my conversation partners throughout the time that I was writing. And thinking about her made me think about your earlier question about how people might not want to do this hard work. They would rather not feel the feels. And I remember that something that she often does when she gives presentations to largely white audiences is she asks them to be uncomfortable, to be willing to be uncomfortable. And the phrase that she uses, which I love so much, is she asks them to be a half shade braver. A half shade. She is such a wonderful and compelling presence. I hope that maybe you will reach out and think about including her in some of this work. Catherine Meeks, Catherine with a C. And I'd be happy to connect you after we finish up if that would be something of interest to you.
I would love that. Yeah, definitely.
And then the other thing that I remember from Catherine is that we did a program together in New York City at Trinity Church Wall Street, which I guess short of maybe the Vatican is the wealthiest church in the entire world. Yeah. It was like, a gift from British royalty. Basically, the Queen, whatever, gave Southern Manhattan to Trinity Church. So we were doing this amazing program. I was on stage with David Diggs from Hamilton, and we were talking about his movie, Blind Spotting, which is an amazing film. I don't talk about it in the book, but I screen that a lot. And Catherine Meeks was our keynote, our theological keynote speaker. And she told a story from the Gospels, which is one of my favorite stories. I remember my grandma used to love it. My grandma was a Pentecostal, and she prayed a lot for people to get better. She laid on hands and believed, that to be Christian is to believe that God is going to heal you. And there's a story in the Gospels about this man who has been crippled and sitting by a pool for decades. And the story is that the angel will stir the water and the first person to get in the pool will be healed. And yet, after all of these years, the man is still here sitting beside the pool. And Jesus comes to him and asks him what is the essential question. And it's the question that Catherine Meeks will often ask a white audience. Do you want to be healed? Do you want to be healed? Because she says, if you don't want to be healed, if you don't want to feel the feels, if you're not willing to be half shade braver, then nothing I'm going to say in the next hour is going to matter. And I might as well just sit here and drink some coffee. But I love that.
Coming! I think that was an hallelujah.
I love that there are, at this moment in 2020, a lot of people who want to be healed. And I'm really busy right now, but it's a good kind of busy because I thought that we were years, maybe decades away from having some of the conversations I've been part of this year. And everything that has happened has been tragic and difficult, but it's also opened us up and made us reflective in ways that if we hadn't had this crazy confluence of things, we wouldn't be able to have some of these conversations. And in the book proposal I'm putting together right now, I talk about how polling has changed just from 2019 to 2020. Last year, when I looked at major polls about race and attitudes toward race in this country, they were, as they have always been, largely delineated by what race you are. If you were a white person in 2019, you didn't feel like racism was a serious problem. If you were a person of color, you knew that it still was. This year, the polling from June on shows a much, much larger number of white people who recognize that this is a problem that we have not dealt with. And so we talk about, moments in history when things can happen. And I firmly believe that this is one of those moments. If we seize the moment, if we will be a half shade braver, if we'll get out and march and preach and do all the different things that people have been doing forever. But this is the moment where it feels like the fulcrum, where something could swing over into a place of more inclusiveness and more justice.
We got a question from the chat, and I want to give a special shout out to Pete Ballard because he's driving to Atlanta right now.
Oh, Pete!
This, and he just left our place after a weekend together with his adorable daughters, and we had the best time. And Pete is a dear, beloved friend, and he's managing to drive, watch this, and text us a message. I don't know how he's doing that, but
all right, Pete, please be careful.
So I will read that.
I was at a stoplight.
Okay.
All right.
Good.
So
I'll
read
I'm
it for
guilty
you,
of that myself. So yeah, find a place, pull over.
Yeah. Encourage safe texting here. Do you want me to read that for you, Pete, or are you in a spot where you can?
Yeah, it's a little chaotic here.
Okay. So this is the question from Pete. Does the commercial success and acceptance of Tyler Perry enhance or hinder the progress of race in film and society?
That is such a good question. And I think about Tyler Perry in some of the same ways that I think about the blaxploitation films of the 1970s. And there's in fact an argument between two of the main characters in Spike Lee's BlacKkKlansman, which is set during the 1970s, about whether they perpetuate racial stereotypes or whether the fact that Black actors and writers and directors are getting to make movies matters. And I think I lean more in the second direction, especially with comedy. I mean, comedy is often broad stereotypes. So if I'm in a comedy, I'm sure like there is an offensive stereotype about me as a white, middle-class, middle-aged Christian. And we could play me for laughs. I hope we won't, because my feelings would be hurt. But that's what comedy often does, is it paints us in broader strokes. I think one of the objections that a lot of people had to the blaxploitation films is that many of them were serious and dealt with like serious issues in the Black community, violence, drug use. But I lean toward the fact that like a movie like Superfly could star Black people and be written by Black people and directed by a Black director. And the crew for Superfly was Black. And these were opportunities for all of them to learn and to grow in their craft and presumably to go on and make some more movies, which may deal with things in a less stereotypical way. And I guess I would also say that we talked earlier about watching something with discernment. If I were going to show a Tyler Perry or movie, or if I showed Superfly in my graduate seminar, we contextualized it and we talked about what some critics find offensive. And I will often share critical views which are opposed to my own, so that people will get a more full response, which is one of the things I learned in writing this book. I'm a smart person and I'm good at reading texts, but I'm good at reading text through my own filter and my own response that comes from my own life experience. So watching movies with Corva Coleman and Kelly Brown Douglas and the Atlantic's Van Newkirk and David Diggs, I saw through their eyes and heard their responses. So I think it would be okay to say I was offended by this. So if I'm a Black woman and I see a Black man in drag playing somebody who looks like my mom, and I'm offended by that, that's absolutely an okay response. Then we contextualize it and say, why is he doing this? So what's his dramatic purpose? And then you decide your balance. Am I more offended than I am understanding? That's okay. We had the same understanding about the maid in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Tilly, who is played for laughs and who pushes back against the marriage. And so she is sort of depicted as racist in the same way that some of the white characters in the film are depicted as racist. And Kelly Brown Douglas's question, which is an essential question, I keep asking it, why did white audiences need a character like this? So you ask that question, you think about it hard. What kind of response do people have to these characters? Is it purely humor? Is there something painful about it? And then you kind of acknowledge that, weigh those things and come to some conclusions. I don't watch Tyler Perry because I don't think they're very good movies, but there are some really interesting racial things about them. So I guess I just outed myself as a snob right there. I would watch them. You would not have to do Green Eggs and Ham to get me to watch them. I would watch them.
Well, to bring it kind of full circle back to Atlanta for a moment, we're talking about if this story sort of begins in part with the premiere of Birth of a Nation in Atlanta in 1915 and the resurrection's probably the wrong word, the revival of the Klan.
Right.
Same time. And then in 2020, Tyler Perry owns, the largest Black-owned studio in Atlanta.
I know.
And now Atlanta has become a huge site for Black-produced films. And it's transforming, South Atlanta. And that's a pretty amazing, to go back to your 100-year-old guests in your audience.
I know.
That's a pretty incredible trajectory on its own. What that means and the quality of, I will plead ignorance on Tyler Perry's films because I haven't seen any of those either. But
what I know about Tyler Perry, I mostly know from what I see Tracy Jordan doing on 30 Rock, which I'm assuming is Tyler Perry.
Yeah.
So I'm just totally ignorant. So I'm an ignorant snob is what I am. But
that's kind.
Yeah, Pete, I love that you have made that connection because I was listening to something on NPR the other day where it was talking about he has, created this vast complex where people like him can make movies. And it is the 180-degree turn that we were talking about and that we were hoping for. In every great story, you start with brokenness and you end with some kind of reconciliation or redemption. And I hoped that we were getting closer to reconciliation and redemption by the end of my book. But that Tyler Perry story is, that's a really redemptive story. That, 100 years ago, Black people were not even allowed to play themselves as villains in D.W. Griffith's film. They're all white actors in blackface. And now here is a Black studio owner, producer, director, actor, writer, who is making it possible for other people to tell their stories. And that I think that really is that lovely full circle that can leave us with some hope.
Well, on that note, maybe that's a good place to stop. As 1:30, man, I feel like, first of all, I have to say I feel really jealous of your job that you get to watch with your students and talk about really important questions and existentially important questions. That's a sweet gig.
It is
And
a sweet gig.
I'm glad you're doing it because I can't think of anybody better, as a guide through these works of art and works of personal impact. And it made me think. I don't know how you're doing this in a virtual sort of setting now, but I'd love to. It got me thinking about like a Deeper South film series and like a watch party or something where we could get you to come back and sort of guide us through one of these films.
That would be fun.
And
that
watch
would be fun
together. I think that would be really cool.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I'm doing a lot of film festivals. I did Breckenridge a couple weeks ago. I'm doing Austin Film Festival next week. Everything, of course, is online. All the movies are online. And then I'm sort of holding back from a lot of the retreats that I've been doing because they're so much more powerful when you're in person. But I do think that it's possible to have an online conversation, particularly about a shared experience. So my literature class is doing fine. We're making that work. And as I was telling Pete earlier, it's obviously not what any of us prefer, but it's what we have. And we're finding some strengths and some grace in the different ways we're responding to each other. And I am going to have to go because my class actually started 2 minutes ago. I told them I might be a little late because I was going to be having a great conversation about race and film.
Well,
and it absolutely has been.
You're right. Thank you so much, Greg. I'll let you dash. And this has been so rich and wonderful. I hope we can do this again. And,
yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for watching live or later.
Thank you.
God bless. And I hope to see you all in the real world at some point.